Formables have been a part of Rise of Nations since the dawn of its release, and we all know what they are at this point. When it comes to formables in the game, some are obviously way harder than others, but there's two of them that are interesting. Those two being the Spanish Empire and Colonial France. Both are obviously already hard enough to form, but then there's the big question, which one is harder to achieve? So today, we'll be putting these two formables head to head, breaking down which one is actually harder to form and why. The way that this debate will work is simple. I will be going through certain stats or topics that usually determine the difficulty of a formable, whether it be their economy, manpower, potential player wars, and much more. And depending on which formable has a harder time on a certain topic, then that formable will be getting a point. The one with the most points will then be considered as the harder formable. And with that explanation out of the way, let's begin this debate. We'll start off with the basic early game stats that both nations have and see which one has better overall stats. Spain starts off with around 23 million population, 1.5 million USD income, 2.02% yearly population growth, 120,000 starting troops, 5.6 million population in their capital, ranks 21 globally, and a total of 3 square cities. Overall, pretty solid stats, but what about France? Well, France starts off with 25 million population, 1.8 million income, 2.03% yearly population growth, 130,000 starting troops, 10 million population in their capital, ranks 17 globally, and finally 4 square cities. Despite both nations having basically the same economies, populations, etc., we can still see that France is just slightly better than Spain in this situation. So for this, the Spanish Empire gets a point. Both countries have very similar but also very different locations at the start of the game, which can shift how the attempts of forming the formables go. Looking at both nations, we can clearly see that France, without a doubt, will generally have a much harder time than Spain. Spain is surrounded by a lot more weaker nations than strong nations, the only real threat being France themselves, and if they're incredibly unlucky, maybe even the US, as some American players usually want a base in Europe. Putting all of that aside, however, Spain will generally have a much easier run early game, since they already have an easy early game formable plus some micronations near them. As for the case of France, even though France is also surrounded by more micronations than Spain and even a couple of weaker ones, they aren't exactly in such a cozy spot. They're surrounded by 3 strong European nations, which most of the time always choose to invade France if they see that France doesn't do much. Although for some players it might be easy to pick them off one by one, at the end of the day, Spain is generally in a much cozier spot. With all of this concluded, Colonial France gets a point. Of course, every formable comes with certain territory that needs to be conquered and annexed in order to be able to form. The Spanish Empire needs a total of 22 countries in order for it to form, whilst Colonial France requires a total of 35 countries. And we aren't only talking about the nations required for these formables, but as well as their locations and the amount of traveling too. The Spanish Empire surprisingly has to travel to quite literally every single continent except Antarctica. Meanwhile, Colonial France needs to travel to just 4 different continents. However, this doesn't mean it's all bad for Spain, because despite having to travel to every single continent, not only does it require less nations, but around 90% of the countries required to form are all in North and South America, which is sometimes easy to expand in. Colonial France, on the other hand, is a different story. Yes, most of the countries needed are in Africa, but the other countries needed to form are quite far, and if you just generally look at both sides, you can see that France will have a harder time traveling and invading these nations. So for this, Colonial France gets a point. With formables as big and as time-consuming like the Spanish Empire and Colonial France, there will undoubtedly be many threats that can oppose and prevent you from forming any of these two formables. So first, let's go ahead and look at some countries that can not only be potential players, but that you can also potentially get into a war with. Although I said that Spain will probably be safe during the early stages of the game, mostly in their own continent, I never said that they won't have any potential enemies. So let's go ahead and take a look at the potential future wars that they can get into with certain player countries. Starting in Europe, there can be quite a lot of enemies to face, like France, the UK, and sometimes even Italy. However, this can be easily avoided as long as the Spain player maintains healthy relations with everybody in Europe, and maybe even ally some of them. Next, in Africa, well, to be honest, there most likely won't be any player wars that they would have to face. The closest threat that they could get in Africa is if Nigeria or the DRC are a player, and even then, the chances of you actually getting into a war with them is quite low. Moving on to North and South America, the potential player wars that you could get into would be with two specific nations, those being Mexico and Colombia. Ignoring the US and Brazil, Mexico and Colombia are the two most likely countries that can become players, and since Spain needs both countries to form the Spanish Empire, they would have to inevitably get into war with either of the two countries. Finally, over to Asia, the only potential threat could be Japan, since they would need the Philippines to form the Japanese Empire. But there really aren't many threats in Asia. And now, moving on to France, in Europe, they might have to face a war with either the UK or Italy, or most of the times even Germany, and sometimes Spain. Of course, they can also follow the same strategy of maintaining peaceful relations with everybody, but France is in a less cozy spot, as mentioned before, since they are basically surrounded by every strong European nation, meaning that at times they can be an easy target. As for every other continent, well, I'll just simply put them on screen as you can see, and you'll see why they can be a potential threat. Now, comparing both nations and their potential threats side by side, we can see that Colonial France has slightly more potential threats than the Spanish Empire. With this, Colonial France gets a point once again. I know a lot of you at this point have the same question. You're still forgetting a handful of countries that can be a threat to Spain or France during their attempts at forming their empires. Why didn't you include them? Well, that actually takes us to the next topic of this debate, that being this topic will feature basically the same exact thing as the last one, but the only difference is that these threats will be 100% an actual outcome. Starting with the Spanish Empire, they would have to face actual superpowers like Brazil and the US. 99% of the time, Brazil will not only be a player, but also invade at least one country from America. Even though they can maybe work out a negotiation, it seems very unlikely that the Brazil player would agree to anything. In the case of the United States, most of the time they take over Mexico in order to be able to form an AU. Again, this can be avoided if Spain can work out a deal with them, but we all know USA players don't like to negotiate. I mean, it's just unlikely. Now, as for Colonial France, well, there's really only one most likely threat that they can get into a war with, and that would be Turkey, since France would need Syria. With all of this being said, the Spanish Empire gets a point. And with that, the final score is here. Looking at the results, we can see that Colonial France is the harder formable. To be honest, the Spanish Empire was very close to taking the win, but just looking at the results and just the overall stuff required to achieve both formables, it's basically just common sense that Colonial France would be considered more challenging. I know that a lot of you probably have some different opinions or stuff that you want to add on, so if you do, then please don't hesitate to drop a comment below. I mean, I know for a fact some of you are going to do this because I did make a community post asking which one was the harder formable, and the majority voted the Spanish Empire. But yeah, thank you everybody for watching this video. Let me know if you guys would like to see another debate video like this, and I'll see you all in the next one.